Lighting the Candle, A World That Works. And I'm Bill Carell. I'm here at the beginning of this podcast with my dear friend, Jan Jeremias. And we've got lots to talk about. And you were just sharing with me before we came on about an interesting conversation between two pretty learned people. And I could actually hear the title going a lot of different directions. And was something along the lines of the new rise of authoritarianism?
Yeah, and just I guess the change in democracy and um, what living in a democratic state or country and it is now looking like, and why there's that shift. And if we want to basically retain a democracy, what needs to be done. And I'm not a hugely, I can't say I'm a very political person at all. Um, but I think I come from a place in my life or an upbringing where I truly value, that idea of democracy coming from, a lot of us who were, for our first generation Americans, and our parents had a different kind of belief in this country and what it was
Yes.
going to offer.
Well, it's an interesting concept. Other than some tribes in Africa, I'm not quite sure that there's anywhere in the world where there's a practicing democracy at work. They usually are using democratic backbone, but it's a republic or it's not. So, for instance, if we look at the UK, although they have a monarch, it's a figurehead and is not necessarily wielding much more than, shall we call it, moral suasion. A phone call from the king every now and again could probably get some things that are interesting looked at. However, in a parliamentary society that they operate in, what you find out is that the average citizens really don't have all that much to do with the government. There's really, it ends when they vote for people into office, and after that, and it's the same really in the French society as well. How people let the parliamentarians know that they're not happy with them as they strike. They have and it's part of the culture. It's as accepted as saluting the flag and singing the Marseillaise, or God Save the King. And what's really kind of interesting about that is that when you think about what authoritarianism has always been, it has been this kind of a tension between security and fear, where freedom is really not even a part of that conversation.
Well, um, yeah, I think that a lot of what they talked about in this, and it was the shift, and let's say in countries which we might call, even if they're like, you clarified by saying they're really not, but we might classify as being democratic places or
Yes.
democratic countries, is the shift in mentality. And one of the things she talked about is complacency, is this um kind of feeling or behavior that's now kind of present, which is a whole group of people who never really had to fight for anything, who basically got everything handed to them. There was no element of struggle or having had their, for large groups of people, never had their beliefs questioned or whatnot, is one aspect of it. And the fact that, sometimes when boredom kicks in and there's still things that are quote unquote wrong, you're looking for some figure to kind of move you out of that. Um, the other thing, so that was one whole aspect of, that I thought was kind of interesting to me. Um, and not coming, that was not my that wasn't the way I was brought up, but I think there are whole groups of people that really have a lot of advantages that never really had You know,
Yeah, there's a man whose books I don't know much about him as a writer, but he had a trilogy that I read when I was in high school, and it was called "The Trees, the Field, and the Town" were the three books, and his name is Conrad Richter. And what it was kind of a set of stories about a group of people that go through this metamorphosis where they everything in the world is a threat to them in the beginning. You know, the weather, you know, the temperature, wild animals, Indians, you name it. There's, you know, tough to get a good night's sleep, you know, out on the prairie somewhere, you know, or in the trees when you're cutting down trees to build a cabin. And it talks about, you know, their struggles, and of course the strong leader is very important in that situation. You can project from that, you know, to whole populations and cultures where people who generally feel like they can live with how bad it is, it's not bad enough to make a, you know, a change and really commit themselves one way or the other and lose their lives over it, you know, that sort of thing. um so they're looking for that Iron Man to come out of the woods and more or less just take, you know, charge of the situation and dictate, you know. And the interesting part of that is when you juxtapose that to the notion of democracy and a republic. You know, I'm always thinking about Ben Franklin supposedly coming out of Independence Hall after they had voted and decided, you know, and written the Constitution and all that. And he said, "Well, you've got a republic if you can keep it."
I often think about that too. That quote. Um, the other thing, they discussed quite a lot is that, in the response to change, people usually are looking for some sort of stabilizing force. So they're looking for something that's steady and grounded, that's not changing.
Right.
And so this idea and talking about how much change has happened over the past, we could say, 100 years, you know, since if you want to go back to, the 1900s or whatever, and the amount of change that has taken place for people over this period of time. And that being this huge impetus for people. People want to feel like something is safe and something is not changing.
Well, see, the thing of it is that they're wishing for something that is not in fact present for them.
Right.
So, so they're willing to give up, and that was another famous Ben Franklin quote, which whoever whoever would bargain their freedom for security deserves neither. You know, so the words are somewhat like that. But Ken, welcome. We're kind of diving into a topic that neither one of us has all that much grounding in, other than the fact that Jan had listened to a recording between two learned people. I think you sent it to both of us or did you send it just to me?
I think I just sent it to you, but I'm glad to share it in the group.
Yeah, this will be up Ken's alley a little bit, especially if it's academic and it's not, you know, visceral with people fighting tooth and nail. You know, the interesting part of the snippet is that there's a rise and a new surge of authoritarianism in the world in areas where we might have traditionally thought of them as being more democratic. So, for instance, if you look at the EU, it's a perfect example of what I think they might be talking about, where people in Ireland gave up rights to things that were pretty normal for them on a daily basis so that other people that didn't have that available to them, Greece, Italy, you know, some of the other EU members, um, they were paying taxes in Ireland to support those folks so that they could get something that was coming through Belgium and through the EU. So there's that. And now whenever you've got the looming threat of two or more major authoritarian regimes that are on the horizon and are a clear and present danger to the way of life of so many people, you get a situation And then Zelensky, I think, is a very good example of this, where this is a guy who is a comedian. You know, literally 10, 12 years ago, what he did is he stood on the stage and he made people laugh on television, right? And how he got into the political game is a very interesting story. And I don't want to spend a lot of time going over that simply because people can find that out on their own. But when he did finally get elected to the parliament, it was a little bit like Hulk Hogan being voted in as governor of Minnesota, or even, if you take a look at Arnold Schwarzenegger becoming governor of California, nobody ever gave them a chance, or possibly even somebody like a Donald Trump being voted in 2016. No chance. It was a big joke, right? So the interesting part of all of that is that the world events happen, and Zelensky comes out and he deals with the situation, and people are very sure that he's fighting against a madman in Moscow, that Putin doesn't love his grandchildren, and he really is not good for the earth. And Zelensky is the white knight on horseback that's going to save Eastern Europe. So the interesting part of all that is we've been at this for a year. It's remarkable to me that his leadership style has made him a rock star all around the world. I mean, he flies in and out of the United States and many different countries asking for funding for all of this. And they're in the middle of martial law in Ukraine. The people have no rights at the moment. They're all law is martial law in Ukraine, for the obvious reason that they need to deal with this threat from the Russians. So with that all said, it's no longer like a what if Russia does something. Now it's how far will Russia go before they stop? And in most cases in the EU, there are just not a lot of strong leaders. I mean, that's really kind of true for, if you look around the world, most of the leaders, unless they're in a third world country, typically with military issues and a lot of crime, they're not strong leaders. So, and that's a big generalization for 300 and some odd countries in the world, and it's not fair, but for the sake of argument, the authoritarian model just really does seem to be rearing its ugly head, and people seem to be willing, as you said, Jan, they've never had to struggle or fight for anything in their life, and they kind of make a deal with themselves. How bad could it possibly be if we just let this person run things?
Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting conversation because, some of what she talks about is this idea of society becoming complacent, taking democracy for granted,
Yes.
and the fact that I think she used the word I don't remember. I'm trying to remember what word she used, but I think she might have been saying being democratic, and she said that's an action word. It's like, and so it was just so an interesting in a place where I think people a lot of times tend to be very passive unless it directly threatens them. It's just kind of like you said, like how bad will it be? How high will this get? Is people tend to be a little bit like, I'll step back and I don't want to make waves and I'm not going to say anything. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not the most political person, but I just thought this was a really interesting kind of overview as I listened to it. And then the other feeling was this whole response to change, which I think they were saying that's the other thing, is that everybody has undergone so much change over the past, like, how many years between technology and, travel and technology, and the fact, media, social media, and that people are trying to grasp at something that feels steady and solid. And to them, they perceive this person as being a leader, this authoritarian figure, as being something that's going to give them stability. And there is a whole element of nostalgia, she said, of people thinking, well, it was better then. And she said, yes, there might have been things that were better then, but
here's an interesting perspective on that. The story that I was telling about Conrad Richter, was the struggle, of a family or two in the West, in the woods, trying to fend for themselves, and then they establish a town, and then by first establishing a ranch, and then as time goes on, and there's lots of water, there's plenty of food, you can go and shop at a store and get what you want. Well, I think his moral of his story was the end of all civilizations to date. And he was also forecasting that we were on a slippery slope heading the same place as Greece, Egypt, Rome, all of those great cultures and societies, that affluence is the thing that scuttles most cultures, because when people have affluence, they're used to things being easy and not having any sort of problems to get through their day, and all they have to do is go along to get along, and they've got plenty of money. But now we've also got this neat thing that's been happening in the last 5 years, where we've got the government paying people not to do anything. It's like, if they're not prosperous enough, we will help them through this, and we will make them all more prosperous than they were. And at the end of the day, from a comparison standpoint, even though people have a lot more liquidity in their life, in many cases, they also have a lot more debt. They've gotten used to live a lifestyle that was based on an affluent view of the world, where it's always going to be here. Can't imagine that it would go away. The neat part of that is that you talk to anybody that's left Ukraine in the last year and a half, 2 years, what it was like before, what it's like now, they never would have believed that what's happened could ever possibly happen. And that's kind of a big lesson for the whole world. And I don't know that there's an argument for or against authoritarianism. However, when you're living in a country that's going through very critical, massive change, it is a time to pay attention. It's a time to not be complacent. It's a time to ask questions and have some critical thinking going on.
And enters Ken.
Yes. The master of critical thinking.
Yeah. And questions.
Yeah, no, I have many thoughts on this, but yeah, well, I guess the first thing is there currently a civilization in Rome?
It's not the Roman civilization.
But it's a civilization that's occupying that space on our planet, right? It's not the one of two. Yeah, it's so I think that there may be some confusion with this belief that things are unchanging and they'll stay the way they are forever, instead of being cyclical and going through a cycle of birth, maturity, and death. And that's just natural. So, so who we were as a country 250 years ago inevitably will die and be reborn into something else. And whether it's still called the United States, something geographically will continue to exist with humans unless we blow up the planet or an asteroid hits and blows it up for us or whatever. So I don't know. So so that's the thing that always I find kind of curious. And and the other thing is, what makes for a strong leader? Why are those leaders weak? And what's the context of that? Because leadership in times of crisis is very different from leadership in times of abundance. And it seems to me that especially someone who wants to be seen as a strong leader from the perspective of having all the answers, the language they tend to use is one of amplifying any crisis that could possibly be something that keeps them as us all needing their leadership. So, so I get curious about that. There are plenty of leaders who are great in peacetime and they're terrible crisis leaders. And there are also leaders who are great in a crisis, but you wouldn't want them during peacetime. They don't know how to manage that. So they just manufacture more crises so that they can stay in power. So those are my initial thoughts.
Well, see, the authoritarianism thing is something that kind of fills a void that's there. If you have a dysfunctional culture, then there needs to emerge somebody who's got a stronger voice, more powerful, some kind of a perception. But in terms of the shape of the Roman Empire, we have to agree on factually it came to an end because it was all over northern Africa, all through Europe, it was all over. I mean, as far north as Russia and the UK, all of those were part of the Roman Empire. So when we
Mhm.
talk about Rome falling, we're not talking the city or Italy or something of that nature. We're talking about which might have been arguably one of the greatest civilizations to have existed on the earth. And it came after a Greek civilization that didn't reach as far as they did. They used a different method in terms of protecting their territory, and they were not able to. They the Romans were like the Borg. And they knew that all we got to do is show people that they will be protected when they join our legions and the family is ready to go back and farm their farms. And they'll be better off with us and they'll help us build our roads and they'll help us collect taxes and bring them back to Rome. So the interesting part of all that is when does it start to fall down? When people are no longer in fear of someone else taking their life. It starts to look differently when the Danes and the Goths and all of the tribal folks who had been pushed down for a few hundred years finally decided we outnumber these guys. There's no reason in the world that we should still allow them. And by the way, we can go to Rome and we can kick some what and take some names, which is just what they did. By that time, most of the emphasis of those rulers had been on corruption and getting the most that they could out of their citizenry and making up rules just to reinforce that they were God on earth and that sort of thing. So now we're looking at a similar situation potentially not just in the United States but possibly on the entire planet, where you've got a strong movement that if we look behind the curtain, what's going on right now with regard to most of the conversations, it's being driven financially first. And I don't know if you're familiar with ESG and what that is with regard to people who borrow large sums of money, but there is a very strong push for these corporations that are being outed now and being found wrong for having taken a line in the sand. But the reason that they did what they did and they brought in the ESG into their cultures was because it was required by BlackRock, who basically either funds them and they get a good score with regard to the components of that, and they'll either be able to borrow money or not based on whether they have the right kind of culture going on. So there's a little bit of a swing back from that as well. But in the meantime, authoritarianism, you can take a look at it in a corporation. And you look at a guy like Elon Musk, for example, that most people who know him and know his work ethic and know how many things that he's been able to pull off, it's kind of interesting because I don't know of anybody who just goes, oh, Elon Musk, he's a nice guy. They go, Elon Musk, he's a monster, or he may be here to save civilization, And I think we do that more and more with people and put them at one extreme or the other, as opposed to, no, he's pretty much like me. He gets out of bed, he works on the things he thinks he can make a difference with today. And well, some of those will have a lot of zeros attached to them. And that's what makes him different than you and me. So how does a culture withstand the complacency and the cycle that Ken is talking about, where once these things happen, there's a tipping point that gets reached, and somebody who's got a better cultural model with regard to control, command, that sort of thing, they're able to come in and swoop in and take over.
So, well, I mean, any way you look at it, you need leadership in some form if you're going to consider scale. you know? So, I mean, unless you want to go back to small tribes of pockets of 100 to 150 people coexisting and doing their own thing. But even within that, there's going to be leadership. It's just a more intimate expression and it's more responsive, just like a small company. You
Yep.
know, it's you can pivot, you can make changes much quicker than when they get larger, so there's that. But I think that, it's always interesting. I love the martial arts expression, be careful about adding energy to systems that aren't in balance. And, people are the same way. Energy can be represented as political power or financial power. And we don't, I think most humans aren't really considering the level of balance they need in advance. So, so that's why you hear child actors and actresses and musicians that fall apart. Too much energy to a kid, and they're not able to handle it. Or a lottery winner that loses all the money. Too much energy, and they weren't in balance prior to it being invested. So, so I think that you see a lot of that playing out. And if someone loves the feeling of the energy and they can't cultivate an internal sense of balance to use it effectively and appropriately, then what happens? They're just going to try to hold on to it. And they're probably going to behave badly because they don't know any other way to behave. Just like a kid having a temper tantrum. So, you know,
It's pretty much
so
more of
there's,
the
and
same,
again, there's
right?
no answers in there. It's
Yeah.
just, and I think that a lot of times when people are scared, they look for leadership.
That's right.
And, yeah, and one of the difficult things is a lot of times the leaders that would be best aren't the ones who are going to say I have all the answers. So they're the ones that are going to be not afraid to say I don't know, and they're going to be thinking multidimensionally. But for people that are scared, they just want to put their power in the hands of the person that says they have the answers, the confident authoritarian personality, the talking head, you
Yeah.
know so
She talks
yeah.
to that a little bit, and some of that she talks about being media driven. So the people that are in the spotlight, quote unquote, are the people who get the attention, who
Mhm.
basically get attention for maybe not so great reasons. They get
Yep.
attention. And how there are a lot of great people who are basically not in the spotlight that really would do that would probably be much better in that position, but they're not in the spotlight. So they never get the traction, or they're not going to
Yeah.
get the backing or the support that they need. And
And they're
so
not going to be a jerk. They're
that's
not going
right.
to play that mean, nasty game, and then it becomes, the snake eating its own tail because they're being told, well, I only play the game because that's the only way I can get a result. And if you want to get the result, either play the game or sit on the sideline.
Mhm.
So, until someone breaks it, I mean, it's funny. There's this whole thing about, I mean, Ronald Reagan, talk about a TV actor. That was how he got elected. It was the rise of television. Who's a familiar face. People knew him. So there's been a whole cycle of that. I mean, wasn't it? I think it was Obama. A lot of that, his election was around social media, and like the rise of that was kind of correlated to that to some level.
Twitter.
I remember Bill Clinton being on MTV playing the saxophone and appealing to younger voters. That couldn't have happened in the 50s, not that way. So
Right.
yeah, you're absolutely right, Jan. So now there's, and they get very good at, like any good salesperson. I see this in content. There are a lot of incredible marketers who throw out mediocre content, but they're so good at connecting you to the belief that this will be good for you, that, and they spend 90% of their time marketing and 10% actually focusing on the content. And then I work with clients who have incredibly valuable deep content, but no one knows about it because they're so concerned with actually delivering something with integrity and value that they're not willing to just lie or exaggerate or self promote. So they're incredible leaders who are quietly sitting in little pockets of influence instead of having dramatic impact. So it's like a catch 22, you know?
Right. And so it was just a very interesting, as we all know, between news and social media, kind of what we hear and what we listen and what we know about people.
Mhm.
There's no shortage of people trying to gain the bloody pulpit and the bully pulpit. Um, that's not a problem, but there are barriers to getting your voice heard, simply because of how media works. And there, so much of the media is owned by people who are very much interested in the authoritarianism model, like that we've been going through for the last 100 years, since I don't know, since World War I, when I guess that was when the first minister of propaganda, although that wasn't his title, was hired by Woodrow Wilson to turn the tide in public opinion as to whether or not we should be in that war, in World War I. So from that time on, we've had, larger and larger government and more career politicians that are never elected. These are definitely politicians because they're constantly doing things that are to some agenda and moving it forward or keeping it in place. And while they've been doing that, they've kind of lost their way in terms of what the business of government is all about. But there's an interesting perspective when you take a look at a country and you find out that its largest employer is the federal government. You need to let that sink in for a minute or two. There's no democracy in the world that started out intending that happened. As a matter of fact, most democracies are about, we don't need any government at all. If you look at what the Constitution framers were looking at, what do we have, a 90-day congressional cycle, and then they went back to their farms? Whatever it was supposed to be a part-time job. It's certainly not for pay and certainly not for a career.
Were there 340 million people they were serving back then?
There might not have been that many on the whole world.
Well,
right.
and it's interesting, like so what is our budget spent on? What is that money spent on every year? Why is the government that big? I know a big part of it is the social safety net, like Social Security and welfare and the military. I mean, what isn't our military spending like more
I gotta
than the
tell you,
next
I'm very
50?
surprised that you link those two things in the same sentence, because they couldn't be more
Oh
different.
no, no, it's not about, I don't care how different they are. I'm looking at, it's like if you have a business budget, there's money that goes to rent, there's money that goes to payroll, there's money that goes to marketing. I'm just from looking at the pie chart and I don't know a lot, but I'm pretty sure that when you look at what the government puts money towards, social services like the safety net and the military are two big chunks of that.
And
And then
then
there's other stuff put
and
in
health
there as well.
and then
So
health care or sick care in this country, which takes a huge chunk of money um,
yeah.
to support and for to finance.
So yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is
Somebody,
it's how much of that is like what's the benefit we're getting? Like to me, the the government, the size of the government should be right sized to best serve a very diverse and fluid and frankly in an unstable world unstable population. Sometimes you need more employees, you need your payroll's higher because the situation requires a higher payroll to maintain a viable ecosystem. So I'm not judging it. I'm not saying it's too big or too small. I think that lacks a lot of context making any kind of statement on that without, and honestly, when I look at politicians now, if they stoke a simple opinion or a strong emotion, I don't trust them.
right?
If they say boring things that have a lot of nuance to it, that's someone I'm going to pay more attention to. So if they start pointing the finger saying it's those radicals over there, or it's because of this, the little talking points, whatever they are, you know, the border crisis or, wokeness, what I don't care, but all of that stuff. I like tune it all out because what I'm curious in is from a system standpoint, how do we get here and what needs to happen to course correct? And let's not prejudge what we think without having the full scope of understanding what we should or shouldn't be doing. And I think the politicians are prejudging because their goal for the majority of them is not to fix it, it's to get reelected.
Hmm.
So what do people want to hear that will make them pick them again, so that they get all the health care that we don't have for another 4 years, and they get the nice paycheck and the cushy benefits, and all the book deals and all the other stuff. So
Well, in fairness, it's a very, very simplistic model that you just talked about, but no one wants to be a politician forever unless they found a way to make money at it. So anyone that you look at who's a multimillionaire in Congress, and there are many, okay, you have to be very suspicious of why they didn't just leave and go make a couple of $1 million a year being an influencer and being part of that whole network of people around Washington, D.C., whose job is to get people pressured into doing whatever it is that they want them to do. So most people who don't get elected more than a term or two, um, maybe they haven't gotten the bug yet. But I think the very interesting part of what I'm saying to you is I don't need anybody else to tell me that the government should have more employees than any other employer in the country. I don't need to test that anywhere. My own critical thinking says I don't believe that this is what we set out to accomplish, 250 years ago. I think maybe what we set out to accomplish was the federal government should do neat things like, the individual states can't do alone, or coordinate their efforts to be able to do them together. The Interstate Commerce Commission makes a lot of sense to me. The whole notion of having laws having to do with our borders and enforcement and that sort of thing, that seems like a federal function to me. But some of the other things that they're really invested in right now, institutional lending, to college students, I don't think that's a I don't think that's a function of government. The notion of Social Security being part of the safety net, I think that really detracts a little bit from my understanding of what a safety net would be. That in many cases, the safety net refers to a situation where people are not in a situation where they can save enough money to be more than $400 away from a catastrophic financial situation, as opposed to people that paid in, over a lifetime of earnings over 35 or 40 years, in many cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the point is, in terms of lumping certain things together like that, in terms of the budget, and I know I was calling you on something that I didn't even think that you heard, so that it was a joke. But my point is this: we're at increasingly a level where the tipping point is there aren't any people that can make a difference from outside the government. And I say that from the standpoint of, you've got half of the people in the United States that are really unhappy with how things are going right now. And maybe the other half, they're unhappy, but they're not willing to go with an alternative that resembles Orange Man in the previous 4 years. So you've got this tension, between people where, yeah, things are just not bad enough for us to worry too much about it right now. But if you think in terms of our whole electoral process and what's going on, at the highest levels of government right at the moment, and how the media is not reporting on so much of it, I just wonder what's up with that. And
I
I'll
don't know.
tell you,
I think a lot of the information is getting out in diverse ways. It's just less centralized, and absolutely. I mean, if certain, depending on the audience that consumes that media, of course they're going to talk more about certain topics than others. So as long as you're clear
yeah,
on what audience that media is monetizing, then you should know that. So I mean, if it's business pro business, they're not going to talk about anti-business stories. They're not going to talk about corporate greed, because the people that they're talking to are paying them in revenue, advertising revenue, whatever, to hear them say good things about business. So I think that, but I think all the information is out there all the time. It's just, who are you listening to? And is that because it helps serve it makes you feel good about your values, your confirmation biases that we all have, that kind of thing. It can be uncomfortable to hear people say things that you don't agree with. So it's easier to just not listen to it. you know, and then say that the media isn't reporting on it. It's, I think, more appropriately, your media that you're listening to, like the generalized you, is not reporting on it. That doesn't mean it's not being reported on, you know?
Well, see, here's where I'm going to, again, I'll pick a bone with you and try to confuse you with some facts, okay? Throughout the entire period of time when Donald Trump was being impeached, there were metrics in terms of stories that were going on about the Bidens. And throughout that entire period of time, it was between Newsmax, Fox News. In those days, they were more to the right of where they are right now, and a couple of others who were reporting on these stories that came up about the Hunter Biden laptop, or the stories that came up about money from Burisma, or stories that came up, and they would have 7 hours and something from these three reporting news agencies, and 0 minutes across MSNBC, NBC, ABC, et cetera, the mainstream media. So what they were in the process of proving was that there are people in very powerful positions. And unfortunately, I think if you go and take a look at who owns those corporations, that corporate corruption that you were talking about, these are monster companies. They are mega billion-dollar, $500 billion companies that, yeah, of course, they're shaping the news to something that's going to be good for their own personal outcome. And the same thing happened, with Fox News as well. It's no longer Rupert Murdoch's, position at flying that plane any longer. The boys are doing it now, and they're more interested in making money than they are about catering to elderly conservatives, which is what Rupert Murdoch built his brand on.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand. So there are certain left-leaning large media companies that weren't reporting on it, but I heard about all of that from the right-leaning ones like Fox, which is massive. So again, and even from what I remember, it was reported on with more skepticism because there wasn't, it's kind of like, I remember the huge campaign push about like the Hillary Clinton stuff and whatever that was, the email thing or whatever, they still yell about it. But, so there was that probably significantly influenced the election because it was a great talking point, and it ended up being, I don't know, depending on who you talk to, some people say it was a cover up. Some people say it was dealt with, whatever. It created a lot of leverage. So if you have something that's going to be harmful to your candidate that's vague and there's disagreement on how truthful it is, that's going to influence the way people report on it. So and again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. Like I'm not, and it's always fascinating to me because when I try to have these conversations with people, they'll immediately start using all the talking points. Hillary Clinton, she deleted 30,000 emails. Well, what were those about? It was just, they were deleted. So there'll be all of these distracting facts from.
But you know what's interesting? Not what happened, but that's why it did happen. The next 8 years, things changed. And how they did was the major media that reported all those facts every single day about the, deleted whatever. I'm with you. I could care less. I actually would have to work hard to care less than I do about that whole situation now. But what they did do is they completely changed how the mainstream media reacted to stories and how they would, second guess, and the whole Hunter Biden laptop thing and the way that Twitter behaved and the way that Google behaved and Facebook behaved. All that is out now. It's common knowledge. But for most people, it's, well, the end justified the means. And so they've moved on. And what I'm saying to you is I don't know how I get, because I don't trust any media right now. I don't trust anything that I see out there. And I'm kind of curious, as this is happening, are we getting to that complacency because we're becoming tone deaf to things that really should matter, and we're not hearing them as that they should matter any longer because it's just the media talking? And if you look at the media, they have a lower favorability percentage than even Congress does. And it's ridiculous. It's less than 20%. And where did I get that from? Somebody said it somewhere, so it's probably true or not true. Yeah, who knows?
I think that for me anyway, it's less about complacency and more about being very discerning about who is actually worthy of trust in listening to. And, and basically when it's obvious that they're spinning information to promote an agenda, there's a lack of trust. So I think people, especially young people, just tune it out and they just start talking to each other and on TikTok, and it's fascinating, like, watching how they'll take that information and they'll run it through multiple different lenses and they'll argue about it, sometimes in an unhealthy way, but other times in a very healthy way. But that's human history. I mean, you know, we're always going to do that. But there's I think what you're sensing is not. I think there's a risk in confusing complacency with indifference to something that maybe they don't see as much relevance as past generations did.
I
Perfect.
mean,
That's
that's what
exactly, I think, what we're saying, Jan.
and that's
Something
what
changed.
I mean, I think that that's what I was thinking of, Ken, is I think that sometimes there's hard to see an imminent danger. For me, I think that there is this feeling of maybe unrest, of dissatisfaction, of questioning, of not knowing, fear. And I think it's sometimes this feeling of, not that it's not bad enough. It's just, I think, very hard for people to wrap their heads around something that does not feel like it's an immediate threat. I mean, I think I have the same problem with what I do. It's hard to talk to people around health when they, feel fine. And they're like, but I am
Mhm.
healthy. I feel fine right now. And, and I think that that's how I view this. It's like, it's hard for people to kind of put their head, like, to think that that something might be wrong, because somehow, even if it's dysfunctional, they're still functioning. Even if it's dysfunctioning, it may not be normal to be in debt and still be able to live pretty comfortably. But obviously there are thousands and thousands of people or millions of people doing that. So they
It,
go
it's
on.
all it's all easily explainable by expanding the Dunning-Kruger effect. And essentially, what people believe is they know better than anyone else. And the only person that they really trust, and they always consider themselves to be the most knowledgeable on a subject, unless it's something they know nothing about, and then it costs them nothing, to say, yeah, I don't know anything about that. But when you are looking at confirmation bias, it's being trained into people to the extent that they no longer even consider that they may have confirmation bias, and 100% of us do. And quite frankly, the whole complacency word that people were talking about, we talked about that in terms of networking a couple of years ago after COVID started, and people stopped showing up on Zoom meetings, and then after COVID started, they stopped showing up for work. It just changed everything. And it was, the words complacency and apathy, and no one seems to have that drive to get ahead any longer. And with good reason. They've been dragged through a knothole for 2 or 3 years. And for somebody to suddenly wake up again now and be lit on fire and say, I got the rest of my life here to do really cool things. Why don't I start with today? And you're going to probably find that the people that are saying that are mostly the ones who managed to continue saying it during COVID and never stopped. There's another whole part of the population. They're more than happy to mail it in. They're more than happy to go back to living in their parents' basements again. They're more than happy, to express an opinion that this is all too much for me. I'm not interested in it. I frankly don't see how it's ever going to have any relevance for me. And then you have to kind of ask yourself, was that kind of like the intention all along? Was there some of this going on the entire time? The whole in conjunction with the cancel culture, with it in conjunction with all of the nastiness that came out during the last 5 or 6 years on a host of different topics. Were we really trying to get people to shut up and go sit in a corner? And is it working?
Well, and why why is it a bad thing if someone wants to live in a basement with their parents? What if they're, they want to be a YouTuber and they're putting their word out and it doesn't make a lot of money? Are they working any less hard? Are they,
Well, again,
why
who,
do we
who said it's a bad thing?
Oh, no, the way it's spoken about in
Yeah.
certain circles is that there's a judgment placed on that they're not they don't have the same value as a quote unquote hard worker. And I think that's part of the challenge we have right now. And I hear this a lot too. They're mooching off the system, and who who are you to say that? Because I'm not saying, again, this is the general you to people who are thinking that way. And so they're framing all of this through, and again, this is the challenge. You framing it through a lens. Like, I'm a hard worker. I've always been a hard worker. And I've taken a lot of grief from a lot of people in my life because I did it entrepreneurially. I've never done what people tell me to do. I've taken massive risks. I am fine dying broke. Frankly, I'm fine being homeless if that's what it comes to. If I lose everything again, wouldn't be the first time, in service to what I feel is the best way I can bring value into my life, I'm willing to do that. And you know what? There are a lot of people. I know people right now who, going back to Social Security, they did put a lot of money into it and ended up losing it all to $1 million medical bill because our healthcare is broken, right? So, and now someone looks at them and says, "Well, it's your problem for not having savings. You should have invested smarter." There are people who would say that. So, how do you look at the context of all of these lives and say maybe someone who just raised children and grandchildren and great grandchildren and never worked a day, but put incredibly balanced and contributing humans into the world. But on paper, they didn't do the work. Why should they be taken care of now? There's so much nuance that's lost in thinking in these certain terms through certain structures. And that's the thing that I find curious, you know?
I love that, Ken. And it reminds me of just a personal situation because I remember I met this, I know this girl probably since I was a kid. And she literally got married out of high school. She ended up having like 9 children, all took care of them all. I mean, whatever. And I remember going to her when her father died. I went to make a Shiva call and going into her house. And she ran this house like she was a drill sergeant. I mean, it was amazing. It was immaculate. The kids were like like great kids, but really well behaved. And I remember leaving thinking to myself, I could never do that. Like that's just not me. Not being critical of her. I thought to myself, she found what she was good at. Like that, she was a wonderful, wonderful mom. And that was her, like, and that was beautiful. Like it just wasn't my path. And I thought, it was still a great path. It just wasn't mine. And so kind of respecting people for what they're good at is what you're speaking and what they're passionate about. And why should they be penalized for that?
I'll give you another funny business example. I was told early on running a martial arts school, you're paying rent 24/7. You are paying rent all the time. You need to have something going on all the time. And, I had so many classes. And over time, I recognized the fact that 80% of the revenue that we could generate was going to be on Saturdays and on weekdays from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m., 3 hours a day. So I stopped listening to people telling me about how it was supposed to work and focused on what was actually working for the model that I had in the context of the people who I was serving, and ended up with a really, really great model. And it went completely contrary to what was supposed to be the thing that you do, you know? And even like you have to work 90 hours a week. It's like, yeah, unless you don't, maybe there's a way where you can only work 30 hours a week and maybe you get a better result. You don't know because you don't have enough information and you haven't tested it and you haven't lived it. And that's each person. I guarantee there are people that die with a smile on their face with massive debt. And and for them, it was okay. They learned to live with debt. They learned there are a lot of businesses that work with debt. Debt is an asset for them. It's not a liability. So again, not judging it right or wrong. It's
Mhm.
just, going all the way around to the authoritarianism and the leadership. How many times are they saying it's this way? And if we don't fix it and make it this way, you're all going to have a problem. And I question that. I question that on a foundational level. I think that's a dangerous assumption.
Perfectly stated, and I completely agree with you. And the what I was posing was not how you overcome what people are asking or saying to you. What I was posing was people who just leave the conversation. Are you familiar with a term called quiet quitting?
Yep. Oh, yeah.
It's where folks don't even tell anybody that they're quitting. They just don't show up anymore. They don't answer emails. They don't answer the phone. They're gone. And it's an interesting thing to take a look at. Um, and it's tough for me to wrap my mind around it all. This has nothing to do with confirmation bias. I frankly don't know how they're going to get their next meal. And it may just be one of those things like what I went through, where my behavior looked really odd to people older than me. Then I figured it out. Then there was something, for me to get out of it in terms of life skills or an experience where I really understood it ain't coming from anywhere if I don't put it there. And that I can actually point to the day that that happened. So my overall interest in this whole topic is it's a changing world that frankly I'm having a difficult time getting any bias to be confirmed because I can't find any information source that's trustworthy more than about 5 minutes. I literally watch YouTube for hours at a time, and I put everyone on a short leash. You've got 5 minutes for me to totally understand what you're trying to say to me, and then I'll give you the time after that for you to give the justification and make your case. 9 out of 10 times, I'm on to something else by the second or third minute. It's like, nope, these are just people going to rob me of the next 5 minutes of my life that I will never get back again. And the neat part of all of that is that I too have this ability to kind of withdraw from things and choose to really powerfully throw myself at a handful of things that mean a lot to me, as opposed to trying to do all of it all the time, everywhere. That's a big change in me as well. And I can identify with the kids who basically say, we got through it somehow, during COVID, we'll get through it somehow after this. And I also get calls from parents that are very concerned about their kids' behavior doing stuff like that and saying they did not get this from me. And my response to that is they got it from somewhere. I wonder where they got it from. This might be our generation for wondering that a lot.
Yeah, no, it's definitely going to be interesting. I mean, like, even I talk to a lot of people, quiet quitting for them is, will they even notice? I mean, I value contribution more than money or some kind of promotion or whatever. And if I can sit here and do nothing, then obviously, and often what they're doing is they're just marking time to find a better job where it feels like it's going to be more fulfilling to do their work. So, and then the other part to it, a lot of them, they're getting overworked for the compensation in their mind, you know? So, and looking at disparity between, the income generation of the executive team versus where they're at, and thinking, are they really doing 1,000 times more work than me? And I'm not, again, not judging it, saying this is just the perspective that they're using. So then they're like, why should I do more? They're telling me that that my day will come. No one believes that anymore because they're watching all of the infrastructure that supported prior generations break down in real time.
Yep.
So there's no trust. I mean, I am firmly convinced I will not collect Social Security, that it won't. I've known that for the last 15 years. I've believed I will not live long, or by the time I'm at that age, it will not be something that's available to me anymore. And so I got to be ready to deal with that, and maybe I'm wrong, but I talked to 20 somethings who are like, yeah, I don't think the planet's going to be livable 30 years from now. And again, right or wrong, that's what they're seeing. And when, they're watching their leadership rip each other apart, they're watching bridges collapse, they're watching weather systems get weird, correlate it, explain it however you want. That's their lived experience that they're basing their decision making on. So they have they are not in a stable environment where they have the same context for the decisions they're making and the choices for how they're living their life now.
I think that's true for all of us, my friend.
Sure. Oh yeah. I'm not saying it isn't.
I don't have a corner on that market. There's all of us that are not sure which end is up anymore.
Yeah, but they don't, like I can reflect on the 90s as being a pretty cool time to live. Like, like as a business owner, it was easier to make money. It was just there's a different perspective and a different outlook on the world. They do not have that lived experience. So we have a lived experience that they're lacking. So that's the difference in their perspective. So it doesn't mean we're not all processing the same way. It's just if you've only been on the planet for 20 years, if you're born into the 9/11 era, your world is very different from someone who was born in the 80s or 70s, or earlier. That's all.
Those folks have never lived in a free country.
No.
Yeah.
No.
And, to what Ken's saying, when I sit there and I listen to that, the thing about growing up or having a business or having any experience, let's say it's a work experience prior to, in the 90s or even 2000s, or even after that, up till COVID, my practical experience, I taught yoga I've been teaching yoga for 20 years. Yoga now is very different than it was then. Totally different. We were in group classes. We actually, getting adjusted in the yoga class was like the best part, when a teacher would come up and like, pull back your leg or do something because you were in the wrong position, and you were like, feel like, oh my gosh, that's so much better. 90% of the time, I'm not even in the same room with the people I teach anymore, but I'm trying to recreate that experience for them by my words or by watching me, which is very different. I mean, to me, I go back and teach in a regular room, and I'm like, oh my gosh, so nice to see people's bodies for a change, as opposed to seeing a little square on a screen. But we're working off of a reference point, which was a pretty cool time. And for those who are teaching now, they've never had that experience. Like my, people I meet who never did in-person teacher training. So they never got the experience of seeing people's bodies.
You want to hear a funny one? Along those lines, we had kids who we didn't know what they looked like without being able to see their lower face. Yeah. Like we'd only see them, and it was such a weird, like, kind of adjustment to seeing their whole face again. And you know what? Everyone's fine. It was a difficult time, and you can either talk about how right it was, wrong what it was, what worked, what didn't work, but all of us had that experience, which was not comfortable for anyone. There were some repercussions to it, and now we're doing what humans do. We're working through it,
That's right. Creative. And you get creative, but it's true. Yeah. It's like,
it was surreal.
It's surreal. Yeah. You teach somebody's body and you're like, wow, that's what they look like from the neck down.
Yeah.
Well, we've done it again. We've had another amazing hour with lots of good points of view and lots of speaking for. I really appreciate all of the points of view that we can bring together, even if it's not something we agree with ourselves. It's always good to presence other points of view that are not necessarily going to be front of mind for everyone. And this again, for you, our listener at home, a couple of things I want to say is this is all, intended for you to take away what you take away. I mean, none of us here have an agenda in terms of what we'd like you to believe, and that should be real clear from the way our conversations go. There is no alignment, in any particular direction, except for we all believe that if you start with a question, you're going to end up further down the road than you will if you think you know the answer. And with that said, I'd like to just give you both an opportunity for some closing remarks here, and then I'll leave with my usual salutation and aloha.
I've been focused a lot lately on just being able to being a attentive listener. So I would say just listen. Go out and listen to people. We all do go in with our filters, but try to get to a place where maybe you can turn down the filter a little bit and just listen to people.
Yeah, I think it's valuable to study. You want to, study something, the flawed design of being human. Like the book, like Thinking Fast and Slow, is great. It talks about the two different systems that influence the way that we think and perceive things, and how it can kind of lead us down the wrong path. Personality isn't permanent. Your personality is changing because you're changing. So there's risks in things like personality tests that can fix you in place. Willpower doesn't work. The fact that by design, willpower is a resource that's depleted, and you can't just hustle, grind, and discipline your way out of that. It's not capable. Muscle failure happens. It just takes some people longer than others, and how you can serve. So there's all of this, and none of those books, none of them are selling you anything. They're sharing insight. So it's not, you go on YouTube and they're like, this is the thing that will keep you from getting Alzheimer's, and these are the risks, and let me sell you my supplement. It's there's not, if there's nothing to buy on the other side of it, I think that it's worth looking at. And really what it's about to me is, if you can understand how you work better, then you can stand guard to the doorway of your mind better, because now you start seeing things that are influencing you, and you don't have to judge it. It's just, oh, there are 7 triggers to yes. There's 7 ways that I can be manipulated into saying yes to something against my will. Isn't that interesting? Not shame on them for using it. It's so now I'm aware of it. Snap your fingers in my face, I'll blink. That's how I work. So I think that there's value there. It'd be helpful if there was more of that, I think, to help people feel more in control of their lives.
I love everything that both of you said, and Jan, I too would ask folks to listen. And then when you catch yourself listening to something and there's a strong reaction, you might not want to question what got said, but you might want to question what your reaction was all about. There might be some gold in them thar hills, when you can listen, to somebody, yeah, intently, and really listen for what they're exactly saying, and not what you think that it means in terms of your own historic, what it means. You get an opportunity to kind of like build some new synapses, and also question your own way of being, your own way of thinking. And nothing bad ever comes from that, because at the end of the day, if somebody snaps their fingers in front of your eyes and you blink, so what? And as Ken said,
you're not wrong to have the reaction, right?
Exactly.
You're not wrong. It's okay to be angry and know in your head that you shouldn't be angry. Says who? You can process it and choose how you act, but your react is something that oftentimes is just, it's a design flaw in being human. That's, a system that was designed in ancient times that's now trying to survive in a fastly accelerating modern environment. And we're just not fully equipped for it yet. So cut yourself some slack.
That's right. And, and I do think there's great value in examining where it comes from.
Sure. Yeah.
What is that really about? Because most of the time when we really react to something, it's not, like you said, it's not that situation. It's like, okay, what's this really about for me? Like,
Right.
that's
Yeah.
my question now. It's like, really, what is this really about? Like, why do I feel so uncomfortable?
Well, there are people who pay thousands of dollars to get taught how to listen to themselves listen. And it's a very, very powerful way to find out that not everybody gets to live in your head rent free.
That's right.
Someone always will. But you may have some choice and make the entry space just a little bit smaller from time to time. Great. Anything else, guys?
No, this was fun.
Yep.
So I'm going to leave you the way that I always do. And this is, we are lighting the candle, a world that works. It really does work. And it's up to you and me to continue that legacy. And you can start by calling or texting or seeing somebody that you know and let them know that your world works because you know they're out there. Let them know that they're loved and you're alive and well. And until next time, great seeing you. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, a world that works, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can catch us each week as well as the rest of the network at exvadio.com/podcasts, as well as the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts.